Late afternoon workout.
The meeting starts at 5.
I was running till I get to those stairs.
He swam over.
Then I look for the air cord and stair lift.
Stairs are a killer, even if you're in great shape.
Hello, everyone. Sorry I'm late. So nice to see you all.
We've been here for 10 minutes, wondering.
Don't listen to you.
He walked in late too.
Everyone else at the table has been here for 10 minutes.
Listen, Governor. We don't need your 3 cents.
Okay, so at this time we're going to begin the Nantucket Conservation Commission meeting for Wednesday, February 19th. I ask that if you have a cell phone, you please silence that. If you need to have conversation with anybody, please take it out into the hallway, as not to disrupt other people. If you'd like to address the commission, please come up, sit in one of the chairs, state your name, and speak clearly into the microphone so that you're picked up on the audio and visual. And with that, we'll take public comment on items not being heard tonight. Is there any public comment? Okay. Seeing not, the following items are continued. We have Chuck Rowe Nominee Trust at 25 Quays Road, continued until March 4th. We have Nantucket Point of View LLC at 9 Lincoln Avenue, continued until March 4th. And then in Certificate of Compliance, we have Hardman at 51B Nantucket Road, continued until March 4th. And Nantucket Wheelhouse LLC at 13 Massachusetts Avenue, continued until March 4th. Is that it? Okay.
Yes.
So with that, we'll begin the public hearing notices of intent, and we'll start with Suzanne Keller and Andrew Bennett at 49 Millbrook Road.
Come on, jump on the hot seat. See what it looks like from the other side.
It's interesting.
Don't be scared. We're friendly.
Wait a minute. You're up. Look at you.
They've gotten nicer since you got on.
I did. I got a haircut just for you guys.
Just
And a new
so
clean sweatshirt.
Look at you.
I know.
So good to see you.
Took him 12 years, but
Look who you brought with you.
Yeah, I'm letting my hair grow. David Haynes for the applicant, and the applicant is Andrew Bennett is here. This was heard last time, opened last time, but it had to be continued because it didn't have a file number. To refresh your memory, it's an addition onto an existing house. It's outside of 50 feet from an small isolated wetland. There are 2 other wetlands on or adjacent to the property, one another isolated one and another bordering one, but it's outside of the buffer zone to both of those wetland systems. The area where the house is going is in existing landscaped area. It's either lawn or there are a couple of trees that probably will come out because of it. It is well above the water table. There's no issue with, he would, contrary to the notice of intent where I said it would be a slab on grade, he would like to put in a crawl space underneath it. But still with 4-foot frost walls, and that's still about 10 feet above the water table and the adjacent test pits. There will be a silt fence put around the work area prior to the commencement of work, and all areas will be loamed and seeded or landscaped as appropriate. No waivers are required. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions?
I just don't like the look of the applicant. I know the people who come in.
Don't know what to say.
just wait till conditions.
Any questions from the public? All right, Jeff, do we have everything we need to close?
I guess so.
Yes. Would you guys like to close?
I'd like to.
You know, I'm tired of coming in with.
Close.
Is there a second?
I'd like to.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? That passes unanimously.
It really is hard working with
I'll be right
some
back.
clients. You know.
It's almost like he knew the rules.
This guy.
Amazing.
There's the condition that Andy reapplies.
Let me finish it.
Okay. So moving on to Town of Nantucket for California Avenue and Alabama Avenue.
So before I get this started, we had continued this last time. This was the vegetative plantings on the coastal dune. We were waiting for a file number for this one last time as well. I know Vince is here if you guys have questions, but.
Hi guys, just a very, very quick.
4 minutes.
Hi, Vince Murphy, Town and Nantucket Natural Resources Department. Just a very quick overview just to capture it again. This is the planting project that's to take place next to Millie's Bridge. About 0.6, just under 0.7 of an acre, it's 0.68 of an acre. Mostly going to be planted with beach grass and some bare root shrub species. We now have a file number.
Thank you. Any questions from the commission? Questions from the public? So Vince, would you like to close?
Yes, please.
Is there a motion to close?
So moved.
Is there a
Second.
second? All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? That carries unanimously.
Thank you, Chair and Commission.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So moving on to Louis E. Kelsey Jr. at 17, 19, and 21 Folger Avenue.
Don Bracken, Bracken Engineering for the applicant. The project consists of installing a new low-pressure sewer main to convert the properties on Folger Ave from on-site septic systems into the public sewer system. It's about 1,600 feet long, but approximately 300 feet of it on the southern end, the beginning of the system, falls within the 100-foot buffer zone of a BVW. The BVW shown on the map, on the plan, it's a combination of a flagged BVW by Brian Madden from LEC, and then digitized wetland line from GIS, which was off the property and out of the right-of-way. The proposed force main is going to go down the middle of the existing gravel road. It's going to be 2 inches in diameter and 4 feet deep. One of the requirements prior to connecting to the system is to have it pressure tested and inspected by the sewer department. The plan also includes stubs to go to each property, so that each property on Folger Ave will be able to connect at some point. We did ask for a waiver, technically within the 25-foot, even though it's within an area already disturbed. Proposing to put a silt fence at the edge of the road, anywhere where we fall within the 100-foot buffer to the BVW. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions from the commission? Questions from the public? All right, seeing that. Jeff, do we have everything we need to close?
You do.
Would you like to close?
Yes, please.
Is there a motion?
Motion to close.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? That passes unanimously.
Thank you, Don.
Thank you.
Jeff, are you recording on your phone?
We are on TV.
Okay. No, because Terry wasn't here.
Yes. Nope.
All right, so moving on to Nantucket Island School of Design and the Arts Incorporated at 23 and 25 Walwinnett Road.
Couple extra plans here. Brian Madden from LEC Environmental Consultants. And with Don Bracken and Arthur Reed, representing the applicant. I kind of just walk through the project elements, but before I do that, just want to review the resource areas. There's bordering vegetated wetland system in the western portion of the site. This property was previously before you, I think last year, for a septic upgrade outside the 100-foot buffer zone. Wetland boundary, I believe, was reviewed at that point in time, but is shown on the plans. Flood zone minimally extends onto the property, extending off Pulpus Harbor. And then Eat Fire Spring is located within the southern portion of the site, south of an existing barn. And that transitions from BVW to directly to bank along the top of the ditch. That flows off site and then goes under a culvert under the existing driveway and daylights into the bordering vegetated wetland system in the western portion of the site. The property was previously a dairy farm, and looking back at some historic aerials, what was present in the western portion of the site was just a farm pond. Now it's transitioned to a cattail marsh, and surrounding that transitions to a woody shrub coverage, and then becomes more terrestrial in the outer fringes, and there's some invasives and foxgrape entanglements that encroaching on the edges. On the plan before, we did depict the kind of limits of standing water that represent the flow path. There's 2 culverts under Wildwinnet Road. There's an 8-inch culvert further to the north and a 12-inch culvert further to the south. Majority of the flow through the system goes through the 8-inch. However, in the most recent culvert clean out by DPW, the southerly culvert was cleaned out. However, the northerly 8-inch was not, at least on the east side of the road. There's a big autumn olive tree right up gradient, so it wasn't cleaned out. But the proposed project before you is to relocate a driveway onto the locus. The existing driveway that's been in use for several decades is actually off-site, and this was an access point going back to the days when it was in dairy farm, and the property owners have approached the northerly abutters for land swap or easement to retain that right, but have been unsuccessful in arranging that. And this is the reason why we're before you for the relocated driveway. That driveway point is going to be an exit only. The current driveway entrance off to the south is at a dangerous hairpin turn. Wildwinnet Road doesn't have appropriate sight lines. That's just going to be an enter only, and this would be an exit. We've minimized the driveway footprint to 10 feet wide because this isn't a single family dwelling project. It is subject to stormwater management standards. So we are proposing a 4-foot wide vegetated swale, and we spec'd out the seed mix for that area to be reestablished with native species, but that would capture any runoff from the roadway coming up further to the east and then coming off of the driveway, the newly relocated driveway. To prevent any encroachment onto that northerly abutting property, there will be a split rail fence along that northerly property line. In this particular encroachment into the wetlands, as I said previously, is that terrestrial outer fringe. This footprint is mainly occupied by privet shrubs, foxgrape entanglements. There are a few groundsel tree shrubs that we're proposing to transplant and or plant within a wetland replication area on the southern portion of the site. We are proposing 2-to-1 wetland replication, and the notice of intent went through the means and methods for creating that area under the oversight of a wetland scientist with reporting and monitoring to the commission. We spec'd out a native seed mix and a mix of native shrubs. And again, that total area is 1,160 square feet. Within that wetland replication area, there's we're proposing to remove a 20-foot section of the existing culvert. If you've been onto the property coming in on the driveway, there's a small granite slab that's the top of a head wall. That's where the pipe is going to be cut. Presumably that was a historic outlet point, and we're proposing to reestablish, restore a 20-foot section of the stream to natural stream conditions, although we will be proposing some riprap at the immediate outlet point to prevent any scour beyond that point. Appropriate erosion control barriers would be installed on the down gradient side to prevent any sedimentation getting into the wetland. And then another aspect of the project, because Eat Fire Spring, as you can see in that southeasterly corner, the wetlands come pretty close to the barn. In that eastern section of the barn, there's groundwater seepage into the barn on slab. We're proposing a foundation drain to collect that. That's all going to be interior work, nothing on the exterior. That drain line's going to extend out to the west and then discharge into a grassline swale. There will be some riprap at that outlet point as well, and that grass swale will connect to the wetland replication area. So we have 2 points of hydrology in addition to high groundwater conditions to help establish that restoration area. And then the final aspect of the drainage improvements, because that 8-inch culvert wasn't cleaned out, we are proposing to do that by hand and remove the sediment off-site. And we're proposing to go 20 feet to the south just to clean anything by hand shovel and remove that just to help restore the flow out to towards Pulpus Harbor. And I don't know if anyone has anything else to add, but I'll turn it over to questions.
Questions from the commission?
Where is the Fire Spring on the map?
It's south of the barn. TB1 through TB6 is the portion that's on site. That's top of bank.
Okay, yep.
Yep.
So it's up here somewhere?
Yeah, it comes off site to the east, and then we show the approximate extension to the west that goes off site.
Thank you.
Before.
So where will the water go if you're removing the culvert? Or have I misunderstood you?
It's just basically removing that last 20-foot section.
Okay. So where will the water that used to go through that, where will that go?
It's just moving that point further to the south.
Okay. Further to the south.
Right to that head wall that you can see the top.
I can.
Okay.
And then it's just going to pool there, or?
No, it's going to be a restored stream channel that will then connect to the natural flow path.
Okay. Excuse me, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'll take this.
Oh, no. There's a lot going on.
Yeah.
It's a busy project.
Yeah. Right now, you can't see where the end of the pipe is now. You can just see the water moving out as it bleeds at the end of the pipe. We were able to find and show it on the plan.
So it's buried.
If you really look and get in there with boots, you can find it, and we did. But you can see the water moving as it's flowing through. So
Yeah, I mean, the system has become overgrown with
Yeah.
vegetation, so just to help restore some of that hydrology.
So in terms of the 8-inch culvert that's at the north
Yep.
section of the site, you're saying that it can't be cleaned out because there's an autumn olive in the way?
I presume that the town didn't
Yeah.
clean it out
Right.
because it was either
They couldn't find
Yeah,
it.
it's too difficult to get to.
So I understand you're gonna clean it up by hand this time, but can you also remove the autumn olive so it can be cleaned out in the future?
Yeah, I mean that's something easy enough
It's an
to be
invasive
done.
tree anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Have you guys contacted the town about why it wasn't cleaned out?
no.
Might be worth making some connection with them so that in the future
Yep.
they maintain it.
So they acknowledge that they know
Yeah.
where it is.
Yeah.
And
Oh, yeah.
Maybe if they didn't, you can enlighten them.
So on behalf of the town, I will say that the Pulpus Road drainage structures and well limit roads were generally neglected for quite some time. So my guess is it probably wasn't cleaned out simply because people forgot to clean it out, that it was disappeared.
Wasn't there an argument about whose responsibility it was between different departments in the town?
I think it's pretty clearly Public Works.
Yeah.
Yeah.
DPW.
I don't know who else it would be.
They know them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They just need to have the new DPW director know that this is there.
Yep.
Because they probably don't.
Yeah, I mean, getting rid of that automotive will allow a lot easier access for maintenance.
Any other questions from the commission?
Well, so the water from the spring will go across the driveway?
Just daylighting a little bit shorter than where it currently is. Again, the outlet is buried. It's just going to outlet right at that pre-existing head wall structure.
So you're taking a culvert out and not replacing it?
Taking it out and having it a natural stream
But across the driveway?
north of the driveway.
Yeah, so they're
The
not, you're
culvert
not
still
gonna
is
rip the
going
driveway.
below
You're
the
just
driveway.
at the edge of the driveway.
Yeah.
You remove the culvert.
It's just
there
that
north.
Exactly,
And
that
then let it
last
travel the next,
stretch.
little swale there.
Exactly.
This is no dead. Here's a stream here.
Well, those driveways are terrible
Because right now.
when you're driving in a truck.
Oh, yeah.
They are not good. I've been on the receiving end of a, someone's trying to come out and you're traveling.
You're taking a chance coming out of this driveway every time.
Yeah, that road
Yeah.
is a mess.
I used to drop off my daughter in the summertime and it was sketchy.
I used to live off
It's a smart
Margaret's
move.
Way.
People
Yeah.
need to drive the speed limit too, and that would
That's
help.
They were racing to sailing camp.
Yeah. Gotta get to Great Point first. Any other questions from the commission?
No.
Questions from the public on this? RJ?
RJ Turcott, Nantucket Land Council. Just a quick question on the proposed replication area and why it wasn't placed in an area maybe over here on the edge of the wetland where it's going to be less impacted by the existing driveway. And the other comment the Land Council has is to be sure the commission conditions this so that the replication is finished and done and successful before a certificate of compliance is handed out or awarded because of what we just went through with 16 Medalley Creek, I believe, where they were supposed to do something and they did their driveway through the wetland and didn't, and we're 4 years later now and the work's still not done. So those are the two comments we have. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, there were several areas around that wetland that were contemplated for wetland replication. Primary reason why we didn't want to go over in that location, provide some separation from the pavilion, but also avoid impacts to the existing well. We saw the opportunity to restore natural stream condition and then build the replication area off of that. We can certainly part of the proposal I didn't mention that there will be a split rail fence that separates the driveway from the wetland replication area, and we are going to have a berm that provides that separation as well. Based on my assessment, I felt that was the most appropriate location. It's currently open grass condition, and with that, restoring that outlet point and building that hydrology off of there was more appropriate, we felt.
And also combined with the foundation drain location and the grass swale, it just seemed to make sense to do all the work here on one side rather than, we'd have to do work on this side anyway, like Brian said, rather than to do it in two different places.
I have just one more question about the abandonment of the existing driveway. How is that going to be demarcated or?
Well, we're having a split rail fence along that northerly property line along the edge of the driveway, and because that is off-site, it's just going to be left to revegetate.
Yeah, we can't really do anything with it because it's the neighbor's property, so we'll just let nature take its course.
No, I understand that. I just am a little bit concerned about where it starts to curve. People maybe driving a little bit outside the curve.
The split rail is extending all the way along.
Okay.
Yeah, so it intersects the old driveway.
And we're
Exactly.
adjusting the driveway at that location too, so
Got it.
for a smooth curve.
I'm trying to see the split rail line shown.
If you zoom in, you can see it.
Yeah, there's a
circles.
note for it.
Any other questions from the commission or the public?
Oh, yeah, I got
Jeff, do we have everything we need to close this?
We do.
Do they? Do you need a
No,
number?
do they need
Oh,
a file
sorry.
number?
We do need a file number.
Okay.
Sorry.
Didn't we get it?
No, we did. Yes, we do have a file number.
Yeah, we did. Penny emailed it to me, so that's how I know I have it.
I have it too.
Oh, you do, okay.
I think the only one I'm missing is the one for Easy Street.
So since we do have everything we need to
the old
close and there are no questions, would you guys like to close?
Please.
Is there a motion?
Motion to close.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Is-
Any
we
opposed?
We have a number?
3279.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so moving on to Carlton Neal and Nina Marie Weisenberger at 84 Pocomo Road. It's a bigger party than I expected.
For the applicant, Art Gasparo, Nantucket Engineering, I'm before you tonight with a notice of intent application for work within the 100-foot buffer zone to a coastal bank out in Pocomo. This is essentially a residential redevelopment project where an existing house, which is located partially within the 50-foot buffer zone, is being removed and replaced with a very similar dwelling, almost entirely out of the 100-foot buffer zone, and then a pool and patio and some decks are being proposed between the 50 and 100-foot buffer zone. There'll be no structural elements proposed within the 50, and we've included both a site plan and a landscape plan for your review. We've proposed the limit of work at the 25-foot buffer zone, and I believe it's a fairly straightforward project. There's quite a bit of work that's shown in grading on the plan on the the easterly portion of the property, but that is out of the buffer jurisdiction. On the plan delineated in blue is the top of bank, 25, 50, and 100-foot buffer zone. I'd be happy to take questions or concerns that you may have.
Thank you. Any questions from the commission?
Stairs are? Is that what that is?
Yeah, it says stairs.
Yeah.
Art, my question is about the planting area over here.
Mm-hmm.
Between the 50 and the 25, are those going to be native plants?
Yeah, I think Mirka had a plant list. Let me just, you could certainly specify it as such.
Okay.
If you want to make a condition to that effect. I think she's been doing pretty well, but understanding that's what's expected, but certainly a condition to that effect is amenable.
Okay. Thank you. Any other thoughts from commissioners? Questions from the public? It looks like we have a file number.
Yes.
Jeff, do we have everything we need to close on this one?
Sorry.
That's okay. So Art, would you like to close?
Yes, please.
Is there a motion?
Motion to close, please.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Alright, that carries unanimously.
Thank you.
This is the
Thank you.
former Anathan place.
That's correct.
Alright, so moving on to 10 Easy Street Nominee Trust at 10 Easy Street.
We'll use your big one. I was just checking with Paul. We were seeing if either one of us had gotten a file number for this. And we didn't. So. I can tell you what the file number is going to be.
Thank you. For the record, Paul Santos with Nantucket Surveyors, representing the property owner and applicant, Deb Killen and William Lothian, who are trustees of 10 Easy Street Nominee Trust. This is a notice of intent filing for work within land subject to coastal storm flowage at 10 Easy Street. It is the Killen's real estate office located at the corner of Easy Street and Cambridge Street. In addition to the land subject to coastal storm flowage, we are within the buffer zone of the Easy Street bulkhead, which is essentially a coastal resource, coastal bank by definition, and the Nantucket Harbor itself, which is approximately 20 feet or so across the street from the subject property. The application, again, is a notice of intent to construct 2 off-street parking spaces. The intent is to rework the brick sidewalk to comply with the handicap access standards and put in a porous parking grid to accommodate the 2 parking spaces. The project itself currently has an application before the HDC. We will then in turn head to the DPW for approval of the curb cut and actual location. New policy of the town, actually there's an article before town meeting which says that any parking spaces now within the core historic district have to go to the HDC first before they're approved by the DPW. So this now requires us to go to the HDC first, then go to the DPW with regard to curb cuts. And I think it's Article 40 something in the current town meeting. You'll see it at town meeting. The applicant itself is located within historically filled tidelands, so pending an approval or an order of conditions being issued by this board, we will have to file a Chapter 91 license also for the spaces, which is our intent to do, but we first obviously need to get approval or an order of conditions first. We do not have a file number at this time, so I will be asking for a continuance, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. I think it's a pretty straightforward application with regard to what we're asking for.
Are there any questions from the commission?
Is it for 2 Model Ts or 2 SUVs?
It's the standard, well, there's a residential component to the office, so we're showing 1 parking space as a 7x17 and 1 is a 9x20. So it's there is actually, under the planning board's current regulations, this is located in the CDT zoning district, so there is no longer any parking requirements within the CDT district. So this is more of a convenience. They're just trying to get some spaces off the street and have some spaces on the lot.
That'll be good.
Yeah.
And you said it's pervious.
Yes, it's a porous grid paving with lawn area, and the only change essentially to the grade typically would be is the depressing of the sidewalk to accommodate the handicapped access. It's on a side of the street where it's currently a yellow line. It does not eliminate any public parking, and I mean that's what we have. So.
All right, any questions from the public? All right, none from the commission, so we'll continue until March 4th.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Thank you. So then moving on to Escape Hatch LLC at 20 Western Avenue.
Soon. Hopefully it'll roll through that.
I think that's probably the best one. Thank you. For the applicant, Art Gasparo, I'm before you tonight with a project located within the buffer zone as well as the coastal dune resource area. There's a couple aspects of this project. Is you have an existing residentially developed property with a failed septic system. So we're looking to upgrade the septic system, same capacity, no increase. We'll be adding innovative alternative technology to the system and increasing the separation distance to groundwater by converting from a vertical style leach pit to more horizontal style leach trench. We have kept the current leach pit, as you can see on the plan, is actually within the dune, and we've moved the trench to be just outside of the dune. And we're working under a provision of maximum feasible compliance as far as Title V and health protection regulations go, though that also I think applies to the wetland regulations. So we're really taking a system that exists and doing the best we can to get as close to compliance with both state and local wetland protection and health protection regulations. And that's all shown. There's an awfully lot of red, I know, on the plan. That's one of the plans that's before you. The other part of that project associated with the residential portion is that they're proposing to remove a piece of the existing portion of brick patio and convert that to a dry laid bluestone patio, and to also expand that bluestone patio, and that would be located outside of the 25-foot buffer zone. The other portion of so that's what's all kind of shown on this plan. We did, I'm working with Blackwell and Associates on this, and they did sort of a zoomed in portion of that. And then there is an existing walking path to the beach through the dune, which goes on to the abutting property, and that use is not going to be allowed to continue. And so we would like to create our own walking path to get to the beach. So that's the other sheet that's zoomed out a little bit further. We've included documentation in the filing of, the owner communicating with the neighbor, trying to seek, to be able to continue that use. Our proposal is to keep this as small and simple of a walking path, in harmony with a lot of the other paths in this particular area. I know that sometimes there is consideration for whether to have an actual elevated type walkway. We feel that would not be in the best, further the interest protected by the commission, given the length and the size of the structure that would need to be constructed. So we're literally looking at a 2 to 3 foot type, walking path, no different than exists, through this area. And we would just essentially, we've shown a location, I've shown it, worked with an aerial to avoid any kind of there's a few stands of denser vegetation. We were thinking that we basically would just kind of use a weed whacker and, very carefully pick a least intrusive path, no grading, disturbance, and then just work to sort of maintain that over time. And with that, I'd happy to address questions or concerns that you may have with the application. We will need to continue while we have a file number. This is under review by Natural Heritage.
Thank you. Any questions from the commission? I guess Art, my question, just because this is like some of the most beautiful dune fields Nantucket has.
Right.
Who's going to be going out there with their weed whacker to cut this path? I just want to make sure that someone with knowledge has flagged the whole way down to avoid any maybe rare dune species that might be there. I'm sure Natural Heritage will weigh in, but I just get nervous.
Sure. The idea that I had with the owner was that it, I know this might set up a red flag, but that it probably would be a landscaper, who would do this on, in consultation with the owner. Has lived here for many years and is a very hands-on individual. So his idea was that he would, I think work with the person to determine the exact path. I had discussions of whether it was something that we wanted to, flag and try to pick and survey, but it seemed to me that the his intention is to instead choose the path of least resistance and least disturbance. He doesn't even want to do this, honestly. It's
Right.
just
Yeah.
a matter of necessity.
So maybe have someone go and just check it out.
Yeah, maybe have
it's
staff
flagged, we
on
can have
site when
somebody look at it.
they're
Yeah. I mean,
cutting
it's a
or
great,
something.
Well, we would provide the start work form, of course,
Mm-hmm.
prior to, but this may be a good one then to have a condition requiring the pre-construction on-site meetings. I think that might be a good
just
way
see
to.
if there's anything that's really
Sure.
bad, so.
Thank you.
I like that.
Any other thoughts or questions from the commission? Questions from the public? Okay, seeing not, looks like you'll need to continue for Heritage.
Yes, please.
So March 4th?
Yes, please.
Okay, so this will continue to March 4th.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rob.
Moving on to Kevin Martin, 15 through 27 High Brush Path.
Yeah, it's a pity they couldn't continue to use the old path.
People don't get along on that.
Well,
It's crazy.
I think it was more the legal opinion, because when you read the note, they say you've always been a good neighbor, but it just, it's crazy. I was afraid of that.
Trip and fall on soon.
Thank you, Don Bracken, for the applicant. This is another sewer extension project similar to the last one we reviewed. All wetland areas are off-site. The work is contained within the high brush path layout in a portion within Marsh Hawk Lane easement area. Again, the wetlands were digitized from GIS. There will be no work within the 25-foot setbacks from the wetland areas. There will be some work within the 50-foot setbacks. All work will be in existing disturbed areas. The force main will run along the easterly side, along the edge of the road of Brush Path. Connections will be under the road going to each lot. There are no further lots to the west as the road turns that are going to be connected, so it ends right at that curve. Again, it will be a 2-inch line, pressure tested and inspected by the town. And also silt fence will be added along the limits of the work within the wetland buffer areas.
Thank you. Any questions?
Will this eventually pick up Marsh Hawk as well and go down?
Marsh Hawk is already connected, so we're connecting
So
to the
they go-
manhole
gotcha.
at the end of Marsh Hawk.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions from the commission? Questions from the public? Alright, seeing not, Jeff, do we have everything we need to close?
Yes, you do.
Would you like to close?
Yes, please.
Is there a
Motion to close.
motion? Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? That passes unanimously.
Thank you.
Thank you. So moving on in the public meeting to request for determination, we have Mid-Island Service Limited Partnership at 41 and 43 Sparks Avenue.
I'm here in place of Jeff. He's on vacation. There you go. I'll tell you where he is. Leo Asadorian for the applicant. I'm here with Bolton Sinclair, who's the general manager of Mid-Island Service. And we filed an RDA on this project because currently it's before the planning board, being heavily vetted, has been heavily vetted by both Ed Pesci, Rob McNeil, and of course the Nantucket Land Council. And we're in the process, we've kind of put off getting everything back to the planning board, well, because we wanted to come in here first and just present the application to you. But we made changes, we incorporated changes based on suggestions from Mr. Pesci and Rob and the Land Council. And some things to point out was originally we had the drainage out in the county layout, we were asked to move it. And the reason why we originally put it in the position that it was because of the monitoring wells out there. There are 13 borings and monitoring wells on the site. They're all earmarked to be decommissioned this spring. They're no longer needed. So with the removal of these wells in those areas, they'll be filled with a slurry. We were able to move the drainage out of the layout, which made the county happy, to be honest with you. We installed a storm scepter unit prior to going in infiltration, and we also increased the size of the infiltration unit to handle a much larger storm. There's also and I'm not sure how many here understand what the drainage system in the town is, but there are two basins that are connected with an outlet pipe into the wetland across the street. And we inserted a EPAC insert into that basin during the construction to keep any siltation from the site, because the concrete has to be jackhammered up and that has to be installed. So there'll be, some environmental catchment right here in this basin during the course of construction. But we feel with the installation of the storm scepter unit, which removes TSS and removes hydrocarbons, it has to be cleaned. And the other thing was, we are also required under the special permit to produce, I haven't submitted to the commission, be happy to, once it's fully vetted, is a operation and maintenance manual for the whole site. And if you want to look at it, pass it around. I just need to take it with me because it's still in the process of being reviewed. And again, obviously, if this wasn't a special permit, we would have come in with an NOI and went through the whole routine. But like I said, it's already being vetted by 3 different entities right at the moment. So, and again, the RDA was an agreement between Jeff, myself, and Ed Pesci when we met with him in December that we thought would be the best approach to solve this application, because we were in the buffer zone to that existing wetland that's on town property across the street. And the whole purpose right now for the whole drainage system is to make sure there is no runoff from this site going into the county layout, and that's what we've accomplished. We've improved the situation. We don't think we could do any more at this stage of the game. So, we've put in, BMP structures. We've catched the roof runoff. Just to explain, even though it's outside your area jurisdiction, the new car wash has 3 1,500-gallon recycling tanks. The water's reused, it's recycled. And eventually, once it gets to a certain level, it goes into another oil water separator before it goes into the town sanitary sewer system, which is allowed under the plumbing code. So I just wanted you to know that there's nothing going to be coming out from the car wash itself and running down into the drainage system. This drainage system will strictly take any runoff that hits the pavement and the concrete that's out there. So with that, I'll just take any questions, or if you have any comments.
Sure. So it has a filter that goes down to 5 microns?
Well, that's what it says.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. It's a very expensive unit too. They don't give them away. So,
right.
We've been using.
They do use a lot more.
Yeah, recently I know that we've used them out at Mycomb Golf Club. I know they put them in Old South Road under the Richmond project, and Rob McNeil still a little bit wanted the oil water separators, but we told them that's a little technology, the new technology of these units, and they come in different sizes. This is a smaller unit because of the area that it needs to capture and treat before going in there. But there's a whole maintenance schedule to that whole thing, and it has to be cleaned out, the oil and sands.
Condition to get the records of that.
Yeah.
On a regular basis to know, who's responsible and just have a copy of them.
Yeah, that'll be part of the special permit conditions anyways, because like I say, there's a schedule in the operation and maintenance manual that is suggested by Storm Scepter, which is now owned by Context, and they'll have to follow the schedule for maintaining the structure itself. And we do have it cleaned out. We have the one at Mycomb cleaned out. We have a different unit out at the water company when they rebuilt it. It's a downstream Defender. It's a little bit different structure. Same principle though. It still needs to be cleaned. Unfortunately, we don't have, we do have a unit here, but there's no place to dispose of it. It has to be a vac truck. And I did talk to Rob about that, about eventually the town being able to do these. They're expensive. There used to be a truck on the island owned by Dynas, but he sold it and moved. And Kenny had one, yeah. But obviously you have to dispose, it has to be handled as a hazardous waste when it comes out. So again, we filed it as an RDA because of the heavily vetted project that it is right now, and didn't feel filing a notice and going through a fourth would really accomplish anything at this stage.
Any other questions from the commission? Other questions from the public? So Jeff, what is staff's recommendation?
So I think our recommendation would be for that -3 for allowing the work in the buffer zone without requiring the notice of intent. But I think based on the conversation, we would also include a condition that the final operation and maintenance agreement be provided to the commission, and then records of any cleanouts and maintenance on the system be provided as well.
Yeah. So move
that
to
would be our
approve-
recommendation. Very well.
Move to approve as amended.
Okay.
Second.
Is there a second? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? That
Good-
passes
Good-
unanimously.
Good project. It's good.
Yeah, well, it's gonna prove what's there now, obviously.
So now I gotta do it. You know what? All right. Fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, and then we're moving on to the JRG Realty Trust at 27 Washing Pond Road.
Good evening, Mark Ritz from Site Design, representing the applicants at 27 Washing Pond Road. What you have before you today is an RDA for the construction of an upgraded septic system. The wetland line on the property was delineated by Mr. Madden, but he took off. He didn't want to hang around. We're proposing to install the actual leach facility in a very small portion of the property that's outside the 100-foot buffer. The only thing that's within jurisdiction is going to be replacement tanks and a force main. Everything is outside of the 50-foot buffer in previously altered portions of the property, driveway, landscaped areas. That's pretty much the extent of the project.
Thank you. Any questions from the commission? Jeff, does staff have a recommendation for this one?
Just the same, positive, well, we have the +2 for the resource area confirmation, and then the -3 allowing for the work.
Okay. Would anybody like to make that motion?
Motion approved.
Is there a second?
Sure.
All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? That passes unanimously.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And then just to throw in, Madam Chair, since we forgot to throw on the agenda, but they did get about, there's a minor modification for 36 Crooked that Mark is doing as well.
Okay, so we're gonna hear a minor modification for 36 Crooked Lane.
Yes.
Okay.
It was included in the pack, so it was available for review. On time.
Unfortunately, I didn't stop at the office this morning and I don't have full-size plans. Mark Ritz from Site Design, representing the applicants at 36 Crooked. Hopefully you guys all have this on your tablets, computers, etc. Originally, this was before you as an NOI not that long ago. It was, we received approval to construct utility connections down the driveway going out to Crooked Lane. At the time that we got the approval, the plan had been to run the sewer connection across to the western side of Crooked Lane and connect to what we thought was there at the time. Upon further discussion with DPW, we need to have the force main go up the eastern side of Crooked and up north. So basically it's going to come out the driveway and run up north along Crooked Lane. It's going to be within the buffer zone to the isolated wetland that the rest of the force main is going to be in the buffer zone of. And we're just proposing to put, standard silt barrier, do a trench in the shoulder of the road and install the force main in the shoulder. So that's the modification.
Okay. Any questions from the commission? I just, out of curiosity, did they ever fix the sewer issue happening on Crooked Lane?
They are addressing it, yes.
Okay.
I confirmed that with Mr. Gray.
Did you have a question?
Well, it was more or less that's gone on for quite some time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think part of the problem, and I don't want to speak for David, especially because he's on vacation, so he can't rebut this for at least a week. Part of the issue is when the lines Crooked Lane were originally installed, they weren't installed by the town. It's kind of similar to Duke's Road, where it was privately installed at the time. And in previous eras, they were not always so good about doing as-built plans or other surveys. So the design plans may have it parked in one area, and then when they look into reality, it's not where it was. It's kind of what happened here.
Part of our
And
issue.
it's part of what also has caused the maintenance issue at the other end of Crooked. But now the sewer department has kind of taken those, and they're actively working to remedy that situation.
Thank you for that information. Any other questions from the commission? Questions from the public? Alright. Is there a motion to accept the minor mod?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Alright, that passes unanimously.
We don't sign
Oh,
mine.
okay. Thank you.
Thank you. So then
Just getting
moving
some stuff out of it.
Yeah.
into certificate of compliance, we have Merson at 71 Baxter Road for a reissue.
Yes, so this is a property that contains both a piece of registered and unregistered land. When we originally issued the certificate of compliance, it was only against the unregistered land. Inadvertently, it was recorded, but it didn't clear title on the registered portion, so we need to reissue to get the certificate of title to be included. So, just one of those weird pieces that was two that became one, and a registry thing. So that's all it is for. The site is still in compliance though, so we're recommending that it's issued and they can close out that portion of their permit.
Motion to reissue.
Is there a
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? That passes unanimously.
Happens from time to time when you let attorneys do title searches on your property. It's closed on this point.
So moving on into orders of conditions.
Take one and pass it down.
So we are going to start with Suzanne Keller and Andrew Bennett at 49 Millbrook Road. Right? I think he was super rude when he presented.
I think we should condition the heck out of this.
Absolutely.
Just
And no
everything
promise
under
of
the
honey
sun.
or anything, yeah.
The snacks have to be provided.
Did jokingly tell Suzanne Keller when I spoke with her about the project, I said, we'll put upon completion, Andy shall be required to
Refile papers.
refile papers to be on the commission. And she gave me the like, haha, no. So,
Is there a motion on this one?
Sure. Move to approve as drafted.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? That passes unanimously.
Go get them.
got no excuse.
Now you gotta build it.
Now you gotta do it. You're probably hoping we weren't gonna approve this and continue it and continue it.
Okay, so then moving on to Town of Nantucket for California Avenue and Alabama Avenue.
This is the vegetative restoration project on the dune. There it is.
Did they not need a waiver for working within the dune?
No, because this technically, the plantings in the dune are required to be in the dune, so they technically qualify as a water dependent use because they can only be located within the resource area.
Do we have any criteria about if certain percentage of the plants die?
We could certainly add that in. We could do it in condition 22. Should the plantings be at less than, I think we have been doing 90%.
Yeah.
90% survival. The applicant shall file an amendment to address the replanting of vegetation. I feel like I've written that better before, but
So shall I move to approve as poorly drafted and amended? Is that what you want me to say?
He said it.
He said, I know, he brought it up, but
Daggers.
you didn't have to.
I'll second
read
it.
I don't have to draft in advance. You guys can do it yourselves.
Uh-oh.
Hey,
Issue
Uh-oh,
a
that's
license.
a
We'll be doing this.
smackdown, yeah.
yeah, that's smacked.
All right, so we have a motion
And
To
a
approve
second.
as
and a
amended.
second. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? That passes unanimous.
As amended.
All right, so moving on to 17, 19, and 21 Folger Avenue, which is Louis E. Kelsey Jr.
Yeah, this was the sewer installation. The only condition we've added, and I did talk to David about this, so I knew he was on vacation, is this number 19, that prior to the application for compliance, the applicant must provide an as-built approved by the sewer department. That avoids, never totally done, but still, is when we had the Duke's Road certificate of compliance request that had come in. Unfortunately, didn't grant it because we got in touch with them, but they had some significant issues that they are still dealing with. That we thought it was better just to kind of say the as-built has to be approved by sewer first. For septics, we've been getting the certificate of compliance from the health department, that they meet health department standards before we issue certificates, but there's not something quite as similar for sewers. So
It's a good trigger.
Yeah.
it makes them go there, and they're supposed to be having it inspected and tested before they backfill and do all those things. So now it's kind of an extra bit of leverage for the sewer department too. So David was very happy to hear that we were putting it in. You guys could just say no.
Is there a motion to approve?
Motion to issue as draft.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Passes unanimous.
Spent all my time on that.
All right, so moving on to Carlton Neal and Nina Marie Weisenberger at 84 Pocomo Road.
Kind of included our standard pool conditions in this one.
We want to add something about the native species.
Yes.
And no
We'll
cultivars.
add a 23 of all plants, all plantings between the 25 and 50 foot buffer zones shall be native with no cultivars.
Move to approve as amended.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? That passes unanimously. Don't have a file number for Easy Street.
Does anyone have any comments for them? Can we get you like an order for that for next time?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's
I asked the draft
Fine.
for this time.
Yeah.
File number.
Fine.
It's good. There it is.
Alright, so then we're moving on to Kevin Martin at 15 through 27 High Brush Path.
Pretty much looks the same as the other sewer line. This one didn't need any waivers for proximity or customary.
Is there a motion for this one?
Move to approve as drafted.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? That passes unanimously.
Before we move on, can we go to the NISDA order? So we closed that tonight. I did the draft.
Vote against that one, Joe.
Yeah.
That's your police chief.
Thoughts or wants or things that people want to.
I'm all for it.
Are there any thoughts on the NISDA project for Jeff to draft for next time?
Well, the normal ones about the replication criteria.
Yeah.
I think maybe having some
Did you have that?
correspondence with the DPW about that culvert.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I have one question. What is the oversight for the replication areas?
I mean, usually they have photo monitoring required.
So the last, some lessons learned over time with replication areas. Typically for replication areas, we require first some sort of sequencing requirement for the rest of the project. Understanding that you don't want to get the project done for the parts they want to do and then just say, oh, sorry, didn't do it.
Right.
So there's that, but we also have been setting up, first off, like a pre-construction on-site with the contractor who's gonna be doing the work, commission staff, and then property owner and permit holder as a part of that. And then we've typically been requiring kind of inspections along the way for kind of milestone parts of the project. So for a replication, obviously, in this case, you'd have kind of that excavation portion that goes in for that and the construction and the clean out. And before that goes in, before they do any vegetation work or plantings, inspect that and get that documented correctly and then move them to the next step, to the point where you get it to where it's complete, and then you have your additional monitoring after that. So a lot of times for just vegetation restoration, we just do photo monitoring. For wetland replication, we typically require things as far as actual inspection, a scheduled on-site with the applicant and our staff to go through the replication area to make sure the plants are there that are what's supposed to be there, and then to kind of move through the operational area until the monitoring window is complete. Is typically what we've been doing for actual resource area replication.
Right, thank you.
Can thank the town for making hash of the replication area enough to do that correctly now.
Comic Pond bike path.
Yeah, that was the classic.
It was. All right. So no thoughts on that one? Or no other thoughts? All right.
You get another crack at it.
Yeah,
So.
next time. All right, so then moving on to extension of conditions.
So these are both actually two reissues. We've already extended them once before, but they didn't get properly recorded. So had some title errors on the front, and you guys signed the only page that gets recorded for this. So when there are mistakes, we can't untypo them. So we got them all corrected and just need to re-sign them. But the dates for extensions still stay the same. So the one is extended for 88 until July of 2020, July 23rd, so this year. And then the other one was extended until 2022. So those dates still hold.
Okay, so then is there a motion to issue or to reissue both of these?
As corrected.
Yes.
Yes.
So second.
Second.
All in favor? Aye.
That was both of them?
Any opposed?
Yes. Okay.
No opposed. Okay. That passes unanimously for both. move on to approval of minutes for February 5th, 2020.
Motion to approve.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you, Terry.
No, she does great minutes.
He does.
Monitoring reports.
So we don't have any other monitoring reports other than the one for the next.
The logs. Okay, so the next item in other business is discussion of SE 482824 daily logs and chemical analysis report.
So I know they are here tonight to discuss the chemical analysis report that they sent in on the sand. And then just to cover, we also are scheduling, Seth had asked for the aerial survey information and stuff to be discussed. We thought it would do this one tonight and then do the other one, so we're not here till 10 p.m. to discuss them. So, they're here.
Hi. Dwight Dunk with Epsilon Associates, and with me is Jim Borback from OHI Engineering. So we submitted the soil sample report about 2 weeks ago as requested. We've have Jim, who led that study, attend, and the intent here is to review the characterization of the sand that was deposited on the template this autumn.
Okay.
Just sorry to interrupt, just real quickly too, is we did, and I know we sent a copy, we got it yesterday afternoon and this morning. We did send this to our regular third-party reviewer, Mr. Berman, to review, and I know, hopefully we get sent it to you guys, but we just got it, so, but there's nothing earth-shattering in there that's not a part of this report, so.
Okay. Did Greg send his comments, or?
Yes, we just got those.
Oh, okay, okay.
Yeah. So we'll forward those along, and we were able to get those posted, but we'll make sure you guys get those.
Okay, thank you. You ready?
Yep.
Okay. Good evening. Like I said earlier, Jim Borback from OHI Engineering. We were brought on board to prepare both the sand sampling report that went into you folks back the end of last year. In January, we conducted the sampling, and really the sampling effort was intended to determine if there were differences between the tan typical sand and the gray suspect sand, and I might use those terms interchangeably. So basically what we did was we went out, we had 19 sample points evenly spaced along the top of the template. They were surveyed by the project surveyor. So we have locations and elevations. That was all provided to you folks on figure 2 in our report. I just note that there's about a 9-foot elevation change between the south end, the higher end, and the north end. We drove a sample device to 8 feet in each location, and that was in 2 4-foot increments. We extracted the sample in a clear plastic sampling tube. We then open up the tube and we can visually classify what the material is, whether it was the gray, the tan, and in some cases it was mixed. We didn't really see any kind of, other than the visual color change, no different odors, no other indicators there. We found a minimal amount of the gray sand in the north end of the template, and it was up to about 6 feet deep or so in the south end. We drew a cross section for you folks. That's in figure 3, so you can see where that sand was, the predominantly where we found the gray sand. We did get under it in all of the sampling locations, and then where it's mixed, and then the tan stuff. We screened all our samples with an on-site field meter, a photoionization detector. We didn't get any responses but for one that was just slightly over the detection limit of the meter. And nonetheless, we obtained that sample for laboratory analysis. The sampling, we collected 8 samples of the tan sand, 8 samples of the gray, corresponding basically to 1 every 1,000 yards of the tan and 1 every 500 cubic yards for the gray sand. That's a fairly typical sampling interval when one characterizes soil. We also collected 8 beach samples. Those were located fairly close to the seaward edge of the lower geotube. And then we collected 8 additional samples in the intertidal zone. So in total, we collected 32 samples of sand. We sent those off to an independent Massachusetts certified laboratory, and they analyzed them for volatile organic compounds. I may call them VOCs, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs, total petroleum hydrocarbon, TPH, recreate metals. Those were basically the chemical constituents. Then we also looked for nitrate, nitrite, total Kedgel, nitrogen, TKN, phosphorus, phosphate, pH, and total coliform. We tabulated the data. It's all in the report. We put in some summary statistics in there. We charted it. And we provided information like the frequency of detection, the minimum, the maximum, and the mean of the detections. We found no detections of the VOCs, PAHs, or TPH above the minimum detection limit from the laboratory. So that none of those analytes were detected. There were several metals detected in most samples. Those concentrations that were detected were consistent in between the tan and the gray sand. There was no real difference in there. We compared the detected concentrations to mass DEP natural background metal concentrations. We also compared them to the reportable concentration soil 1 from the mass contingency plan. RCS1 is for residential type property. So if you have a residential, I'm sort of speaking hypothetically here, if you have a residential property and you find some compound, a metal or a VOC or a PAH, whatever you test for, that's above the reportable concentration S1, then you would need to comply with the mass contingency plan. None of the metals exceeded the RCS1. And in fact, all of the metals that we detected, and like I mentioned, we detected them in nearly all of the samples, were below mass DEP established background in natural soil. So what I can conclude about the metals is that they are natural. They didn't come from any human activity. All of those analytes that I mentioned, the VOCs, PAHs, TPH, and metals, are under the RCS1. This site would not be regulated under the mass contingency plan. The nitrate, TKN, and if you want to get to a total nitrogen, you would add those results together. The phosphorus, phosphate, and pH, we did find them to be slightly higher in the gray sand as opposed to the tan sand. And in order to determine if that was a significant difference, I compared them using Mass DEP similar soils guidance. Now that guidance is for MCP related sites. However, we don't really have a whole lot of regulatory basis to go on in this situation with those analytes. I felt it was reasonable for us to use to determine if the results between the gray and the tan were similar. Mass DEP's guidance suggests at the concentrations we detected those analytes that they would be similar if the means were less than 5 times different. And the difference in the means for all of those analytes was around 2. So I can conclude that the nitrate, nitrite, TKN, phosphorus, phosphate, and pH between the gray and the tan sand are similar. The last analyte we tested for was total coliform. We did find the mean of the results in the gray sand to be about 10 times higher than the mean of the total coliform in the tan sand. Using that same Mass DEP guidance, they would suggest a difference of somewhere around a mean of around 2.5. If the mean was within 2.5, you would have a similar soil. So I can conclude that the gray sand and the tan sand are not similar when it comes to the coliform. We put a lot of information in the report regarding some research on the total coliform. There's 16 groups of related bacteria. They're very commonly found in the environment. They're usually not harmful to human beings. Most of the research regarding total coliform bacteria relates to their presence in drinking water or in water that may be incidentally ingested. And not necessarily because they cause a health effect, but because they may be an indicator for the presence of something else. So there's very little information for us to look at relative to total coliform in soil. Most of that work's been done for sites where they're using sewage sludge or something similar as an agricultural amendment. We also looked at some research regarding fecal coliform, which they're a subgroup of total coliforms. I mentioned total coliforms are 16 different species. I think the fecal are 5 or 6 of those, so it's a subgroup of it. And again, most of the research on fecal coliform both is for the drinking water and in agricultural soils that have been augmented with sludge. The reason because the consensus from the research that we've seen is that total coliforms are not a significant health concern in soil. At least you really want them to be. If they're in water, it's an indicator. In soil, there's not a significant issue with health. We provided some background in terms of survivability of this total coliform in soil. Some of the primary factors include moisture content. They like to be in moist soils. Particle size. They like to be in soils with smaller particle size than, say, just sand. They like warm temperatures. They don't like ultraviolet exposure. And they don't particularly like salt. So when you think of them, they're very common in the guts of warm-blooded animals, all of us here at this table, dogs, cats, deers, whatever. And the bacteria like to live there, and they don't much like to live elsewhere. And so basically our recommendation, while I don't think there's any health effect related to the coliform, we didn't detect any chemical constituents above natural background in the material. So my view is the gray sand is not of a significant health concern. We did make some recommendations in our report. One was don't use that sand anymore, primarily for the optic, to be totally honest. We think the gray sand should be spread and mixed in with the tan. It should be allowed to spill over the edge of the template. Now that's going to do a few things for us. It's going to decrease the silt content. The gray sand has a higher silt content. It may still be within the 10% spec, but it includes more silt than the tan sand. Mixing it will help decrease that silt content, help reduce moisture retention. It will Spreading it's going to help increase its exposure to UV and its exposure to temperature changes. So when it's 5 or 6 feet below grade, much of the gray sand is, if you look on our figure 3, the temperatures are going to be relatively stable. If we get it up to the surface, spread it out, it'll be subjected to those temperature swings, all of which we believe will help reduce the total coliform count. Pushing the sand off the top of the template will help mix it more, spread it out, aerate it, allow it to desiccate, and also expose it to UV and salt, allowing it to erode from the template, as most of the sand out there does. Really is going to increase the UV exposure and salt exposure. So in summary, we detected no chemical analytes, so volatile organic compounds, PAHs, total petroleum hydrocarbons, or metals at concentrations above natural background of any of those analytes. We didn't find any significant differences in any of the other analytes, with the exception of coliform. Total coliform in soil is generally not considered a health hazard. And we made some recommendations to both mix it with the tan sand that's out there, spread it on the template, get it exposed, let it erode, and move on. Don't use it again. So that's my description of the report. Happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you. Any questions from the commission?
Yeah, I'm most concerned about the total coliform analyte, especially given that total coliform degrades quickly in the environment. And we see that the level detected in the suspect sand and then the level detected in the beach sand was actually higher, almost 20 times higher than in the typical sand. And we know that in the period from when the sand was placed to when the sand was sampled, there was at least 2 significant storms that pushed that material off into the beach. But given our assessment of that, I guess you would infer that the sand coming from the suspect sand falling down into the beach sand originally had quite a higher concentration of TC than was recorded and has been environmentally degraded, but is still being shown in the beach. That's why you're seeing the higher recording in the beach.
Yeah,
so I'm just kind of wondering.
So the beach samples were collected very close to the seaward side of the lower tube. It was basically the same gray sand that had eroded down onto there. But when we got to the intertidal sand, there was very little total coliform detected. And so we don't see it as something that's long-lasting. Once it gets into the intertidal zone, it's being dispersed. The salt's not doing it any good. But really, a lot of those beach samples, particularly as we got down to the southern end of the template or of the project, were of that gray material that had eroded off.
And I'm gonna pipe in here a little bit on looking at the means of from the gray sand to the beach. We're talking about discrete samples where they're both in the same order of magnitude in terms of the means. They have similar ranges of being in the tens up to 1,500. I think really what we're probably seeing is the gray sand that's up on the template that was sampled and the beach sand that had hits are probably pretty much of the same counts, maximum probable, the MPN is the probable number that's counted. Since we didn't aggregate these, we didn't composite these things. So thinking about this from a statistical standpoint, it's probably that we had these,
8 samples up above, the 8 samples below, you're going to get discrete samples, and if they were in different orders of magnitude, I think that you might suggest that one was different than the other. Being the same order of magnitude, I would think that it's probably anecdotal that the average but down below was a little bit above the average up on the template.
Well, I have a question, because it's certainly not my level of expertise. But here, where we have the TC values, the minimum, mean, and maximum NPN per G, it says in the intertidal zone on this chart, they're all at 0.02, while the suspect sand template varies from 28 to 1,541, which is approximately 7,500 times as much as the intertidal zone. So that isn't what I would call a similar value. So tell me where I'm wrong here.
I'm talking about the beach. The beach that has a mean of 14.9 versus the gray, which has a mean of 263. So they're both in the same orders of magnitude. I wasn't talking about the intertidal. I'm talking about the beach that was collected just below the toe of the template.
Well, then we get back into Seth's argument about, why they're sort of a similar value. I mean, first of all, I hope we can have Greg Berman here to advise us on this, and thank you for the thoroughness of your presentation and I mean, you're
welcome.
I'm in the dark here, really. It's not my level of expertise, but there are values that are so, to my uneducated eye, so extreme that, clearly, as you said, that we don't want to have this issue going forward.
A lot of the, my background, I'm a licensed site professional. I deal with impacted sites. I deal with sites that have state-established criteria for it, because the state has determined those criteria to be potentially of a potential risk to human health or the environment. So all of the chemical analyses that I mentioned, the VOCs, PAHs, TPH, and the metals, they all have these criteria. Coliform does not, because of what I said earlier. It's not generally considered a health hazard in soil, and it's most of the testing about coliform is in drinking water, more as an indicator. Not that it itself is causing the issue, but it may be that show that the well is leaking and getting some surface water that it shouldn't be, or something's happening. And if I found it in a drinking water well, my response would be different than what I'm telling you tonight, right? I would go and do some additional work, but in soil, it's an entirely different matter. And while those differences, the numbers, you say, wow, 0.2 to 1,500, to me, because of the lack of a health effect from those total coliform, that what I'm concluding is it gets onto the beach, it gets into the intertidal zone, and then it goes away.
Yeah.
And there's no continuing source. A lot of times with sewers, you have a sewer pipe or a leaking septic field, for instance. You're always, you're nailing that thing with additional source material on a pretty consistent basis, which is not happening here. This is a one-time event. Eventually, it's going to be gone. We felt that the recommendations we provided would help reduce those concentrations, not from any ELF-based decision-making, because there's no criteria for that, but really just to help assuage the concerns of you folks to get those numbers back where we're closer to the tan sand.
Yeah.
And Ian, just to, in terms of Jim and reviewing the report that he prepared, my background is in biology. Between my earning my master's and going on for my doctorate, I also did graduate work in toxicology and risk assessment. Used to assist with risk assessments with my former company. So when it in looking at these results, in terms of the total coliforms, as Jim mentioned, the fecal is a subset, less than half the total number of the species. We also find, when you look at the data, that when you look at total coliforms and then look at the fecal coliform component in soils, the fecal is usually 2 to 4 orders of magnitude below the total coliform. So that's the percentage or proportion. So when you think about 2 orders of magnitude, even for the max in the gray of 1540 total, if there is fecal there, it would be down at 15, number one. Number two, the decay in the environment of the fecal coliform, because it's not in the environment that it wants to live in, of a warm, moist environment. It's out on a cold, dry, it may be moist, but certainly cold environment out in the template, and before that on a sand lot. The fecal lasts, depending on what studies you look at, somewhere between 30 and some have shown up to 80 days. After that, it is essentially non-detect because it's not in its environment. Total coliform, you will find, some of the studies have shown that it varies. It will, because that's flora that lives in the soil with plants, roots. It will, as soils desiccate, you'll see in a drought, you'll see the total coliform of the natural bacteria decline because it dries out. Then you get a rainstorm, and it flourishes again because it's moist. And those are always in the environment. They're on our skin. So, in terms of the purpose of the site characterization, as Jim was mentioning, does this material present a risk to human health or the environment? When it comes to human health, these bacteria are very, they're common in the environment. We are exposed to them all the time. Even if there was some that was fecal, the only exposure route is ingestion. That's why they look at it for drinking water supplies and incidental drinking, such as swimming beaches. So, number one. Number two, in terms of the environment, they're present in the environment, but in this environment, when they get washed off onto the beach, pushed off onto the beach, and then exposed to the sun, exposed to the salt, then washed out into the ocean, the fate and transport is they're all gonna be killed in the salt water. So we don't have exposure, we don't have an environmental concern because of the fate and transport of that sand.
But so I kind of see what you're saying, but at the same time, clearly there's a higher concentration in this template than the natural environment, which would be a higher risk in this location than somewhere else. I wouldn't bring my nieces and nephew down to the beach and say, let's build a sandcastle, because some of that's going to end up in their mouth. And clearly this site is much higher than the natural levels, So I find that concerning, that it just clearly shows that this material was contaminated.
I think what it shows is the coloration and the texture shows that there was likely topsoil. You find your total coliform in topsoil, not in subsoil. The sand generally doesn't have much bacteria in it, the subsoil.
So have you guys identified where this came from yet? The site of this contamination?
It was from a pit.
Right, but which one? Where were they getting it dumped from? I feel like for this not to happen in the future.
This was the I forget the name that was in the samples. The spearhawk. Spearhead. And so the coloration and the soil texture of that material is more like a loamy sand. All the tan stuff is more of a sand. So the total, so that would suggest that there's topsoil that's been mixed in with it. So it's a different coloration and it's a different texture. And that's where you find your soil bacteria is in the topsoil.
So Dwight, you also find it in a failed septic system, right? And I know there was anecdotal evidence that this was part of the component. Do you feel that's possible or not?
In terms of the anecdotal evidence of the one site that was identified as potential septage, we spoke to the equipment operator who worked on that site, and that equipment operator took the material that was from underneath the septic, and it remained on site and went under the driveway. And the material from the, I think they're excavated at 2 different time periods, and then the other excavation for the foundation is what was used from that site, from that lot. I forget what lot that was, but the material that, in talking with the equipment operator who dug the holes, that didn't leave the site.
So Jim, assuming that there was fecal coliform in the site, what would be the detection limit that we would be looking at to be of concern?
Well, again, you have to look at what's the potential exposure to that material, which is very low. There's no standard established for fecal coliform in soil. It's not considered a hazard in and of itself. Again, it's sort of like the total coliform, and you sort of winnow your way down to one species that may have an effect. So I can't tell you what that number would be.
There's not a standard.
There's no standard. There's no standard for the total coliform. My personal opinion is highly related to the additional silt content in that material, in the gray material. Very well could be natural. I mean, I can't tell you, do I think it's higher unnaturally or not? Well, I can't say that. What I can tell you is that I know that just from feeling in if you squeeze the gray and the tan, the gray will stick together and the tan won't. Well, so that's a nice field test for which one has more silt. The gray has more silt. It's going to hold more moisture. It may have more nutrient. So it could just be from a natural condition. That gray sand supports a higher count than the tan. It may not be, quote unquote, contamination.
Yeah. And some of the information that Jim cited, and then I looked at, after getting the draft report, I looked at some other articles and, finding, typically the fecal coliform decaying essentially to, nothing in 30 to 40 days, with some of it showing 80 days. The template has now been, this sand was deposited on the template sometime in November or December. So if we were to take December 1 as a date, it's now been out there for 2.5 months, which is time where that, if there were any component, it's now been, out there and
But when did you
to
sample?
decay.
We sampled the beginning of
Right,
January.
so at least a full month after it was dumped and the levels were like this. So what?
Total.
Right, but what were they when you originally dumped this material if it degrades so fast?
Well, that material had also been sitting on a sand lot prior to it
Yeah,
going
but
in
that's
there.
not, it's your responsibility is what was dumped onto that beach. So if the levels are this high when you took them in January, what were they when you dumped them?
I'm just thinking too, I understand what you're saying about most of the studies coming from agricultural settings. I looked into the studies too, and from drinking water, and because those are being the methods of ingestion. But think about this sand being placed by your operators. Your operators are clearly at risk when the sand was placed for incidental contact with fecal coliform. It's a public beach. People who are accessing the beach, not knowing that there is an issue for almost maybe even more than a full month after the sand was placed, are at risk for incidental contact. You know, I understand what you're saying. It's sand. You don't sit there and eat it. If you're at the beach, you're laying down. It's gonna get on your hands. You don't have access to good sanitation before you go home. There's a potential for concern.
Well, they're natural bacteria, and they're everywhere. So I have a pet, I have a dog, I let my kids play in the yard. Should I ever do that? Because my yard has coliform bacteria.
So I don't want to
And
interrupt, but the natural. Wait a second. We have the levels that you took in front of the beach showing kind of a baseline, so we know that this is higher than the natural level. So I don't want to get into that argument here. We have that data showing that when you get further away from the template, there's less. You know, so that's pretty clear.
Jim, just a quick question. Do you take this 6-foot sample of sand and do you mix it all up, or is it done in a grade coming down?
we sampled a discrete portion of that, of the overall sample. So we had 2 4-foot tubes. We originally submitted the plan. We were going to composite them. You folks asked for a discrete sample. So on, I believe it's figure 2, we gave you the depth of the samples where we collected it. One of the papers we cited in our document was a paper by Edmonds. Table 2 shows the variation of total coliform in soil over time. And those levels range from 11 to 11,000. Now, the way I read this is after any application of anything, it's in soil, not sludge. There's no fecal coliform. Total coliform counts will vary over time naturally. They're natural. They aren't a health effect. If there were, I'm sure there would have been standards established by Mass DEP. So there is a difference between the tan and the gray, no doubt. What I can't tell you is, that's creating a health issue. I don't believe that it is. Once it gets onto the beach, it's going to erode. It's going to get subject to wave action, salt water, and UV. Those counts will drop.
Well, I don't feel that we're just going around in circles here.
Well, and I guess my feeling is I trust the independent reviewer who essentially did pull out the total coliform and also some of the nutrient levels as being, of potential concern. And he seems to suggest that dumping this onto the beach to let it just expose is not the way to go in this situation. So I trust our independent reviewer in that regard. I don't know I know you guys haven't seen his review of your document, but I think we need a little bit more thorough of a plan.
Yeah, I think it goes back also to the order of conditions, how it's drafted, and what is characterized as clean fill. I mean, yeah, according to the DEP similar soils guidance here, the soils might be the suspect sand and the typical sand might be classified as similar under the guidance, but you can clearly still tell that based on the biological constituents of phosphate, TKN, and total coliform, that they're higher. So how are we characterizing clean is kind of where we're getting back to.
Okay, I haven't seen Greg's comments, so I would like to see them, review them. Couple of things to think about when you look at these materials. As I mentioned, there's is there an adverse effect? Is there a health risk, human health risk, and an ecological risk? The other element to look at is the fate and transport of this material. That means how does it get transported and where does it end up? in terms of the fate and transport of this material eventually out into the ocean, in terms of the nutrients, the ocean water is typically nitrogen limited. That means what's limiting the growth of the algae, which is the basis of the food web, is nitrogen. So the introduction of the potential increase, introduction of the phosphorus would have no effect out in the ocean environment for the fate of the phosphorus. The nitrogen, this is not a continuing ongoing source like a sewer outfall into Mass Bay. It's a one-time slug, number one. Number two, the ocean that it's going into is open ocean, not an enclosed embayment, like some of the bays, on the Cape or something like that. So with the open ocean flushing, this nitrogen isn't going to change the nitrogen levels at all, and not in the receiving water, and not have an effect. So in terms of the fate transport for the environmental issues for the nutrients, there's no adverse effect to the receiving water of the ocean. The total coliform, I'm talking about the ecological issues here, once it gets out onto the beach, exposed to the sun, exposed to the salt, those cells are gonna be killed by the UV in the salt water. If the 0.2 counts per gram that's on the beach, if that gets out to the ocean, that's not going to survive out into the open ocean. So in terms of the fate and transport on the ecological side, I don't see how this has a ecological effect. And then we've talked at length already about the potential proportion of fecal in these, if it is present, and over the time that it's been there now, it should be, even if is potentially much lower, if not nearly non-existent. The total coliforms being not native, but ubiquitous in the environment, ubiquitous in the soils, are going to remain and continue to grow and change their concentration seasonally depending on temperature and moisture and sun, because those are bacteria that you find in topsoil everywhere. So being on the template, the total coliform, the natural soil microbes are going to continue to live. They should die, be lower concentrations over time, just because it's so granular.
Jeff, is it possible to ask them, just because I feel like we need a good comparison point with what coliform might be on the beach on either side of this template to get a baseline?
Absolutely, man. I think you could ask them to provide a sample of the beach of what's total coliform.
Yeah, like a couple of different samples to see if it's naturally there on this beach at these levels.
Certainly.
I don't know if the rest of the commission would find that important. I'm also just concerned that I'm hearing the solution to pollution is dilution. But that is, though, with what the three factors that you just talked about. You said, oh, it's going to end up in the ocean, no adverse impact. Oh, it's going to go on the beach.
What I didn't say it would be that it was dilution. What I said, what I said was the nutrients. Number one, the
They're going to
ocean
mix into the larger ocean.
The ocean is not phosphorus limited, so adding phosphorus in the open ocean like here is not phosphorus limited. So adding phosphorus isn't going to change the biological oceanographic aspects of this ocean. Nitrogen, it is nitrogen limited, but when we look at the concentrations here, I think you're going to see that there's that, if you want to call that dilution, is dilution, but the fact is that the nitrogen is not going to change the you're not going to be able to have a measurable change in the nitrogen levels of the ocean. In terms of the bacteria, I didn't say it was dilution. What you're going to get is the natural elements that kill bacteria. UV, salt, desiccation will occur on the face of the template and on the beach.
Right, once it's mixed, once it's spread out, and
If
and the nitrogen might not be measurable in the ocean because there's going to be phytoplankton taking it up. You might not you might have an algae bloom out there.
This amount would not end up causing an algae bloom. When you see algae blooms, it's when you have a constant input. We looked at that for Mass Bay with the Deer Island outfall. That was looking at a outfall that's discharging 2 to 4 million gallons of sewage a day. So when I looked at outfall projects, we're looking at outfalls of constant millions of gallons a day of sewage, treated sewage, going out that might still have nitrogen in it. We're talking about a one-time slug, and having the other, some of the other examples in Massachusetts of nitrogen contamination affecting the biological oceanography is the enclosed bays on the Cape. Those typically are ringed by houses with septic systems that are leaching effluent into them on a regular basis, not a one-time slug.
Well, I thought that was very, very pithy, Ashley, even if it wasn't strictly accurate. But I think I can only speak for myself, but it's sort of frustrating that this happened. And
we agree.
Yeah, and you're certainly not saying it's an appropriate method of remediation going forward. So I think we need to have Greg here to discuss it in greater depth and decide where to go from there, because I don't see that we're getting anywhere beyond your summation, and you're right, and from your perspective, I know you regret this, and that compared to what you've seen at an industrial level, practically, this is a much smaller amount. But for us, it's in our backyard, and we want to deal with it effectively and make sure it doesn't happen again.
And we have come before the commission a lot. We don't want to be adversarial. We understand we're on different sides of this project, of these issues. The clients likewise want to have a clean beach. They use the beach too. As I said, and I agree with you, Ian, we certainly regret this. In this, if we could turn back the hands of time, this wouldn't have happened. But it regrettably did. The testing from the grain size from that site met criteria, and therefore it moved forward and onto the template. As Jim mentioned, the first recommendation is, when you read it, is do not use that material again or from that site again. We have presented to you a while back a protocol for sand of the grain size and doing the due diligence, which is consistent with the beach nourishment guidance and the beach nourishment guidance references the water quality cert regulation. So it's tied to DEP regulations, and we have been, we proposed that, and we'll be doing that so that we don't, so we can avoid this happening again.
I think the feeling of the commission is that we want to maybe draft more stringent conditions, including from my point of view, the Munsell coloration test. And I think there are other inputs from other commissioners.
And I think maybe Greg would be good to work with you on that. I know colleagues of mine in other parts of the country where they have Munsell color, they have what they do is they have, you know, wet sand color, dry sand color, because you go out there. We went out there today just to look at what it looks like today. Again, just to, you know, take a look at it. And, you know, you go out there today, the dry sand that's up there, whether it was the gray or the tan, is much lighter than when you know, dig down and look at the moist sand.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, there's some good experience in other parts of the country where they've done that.
Right.
I'll just say one more thing and then give it a rest. I totally understand the comment about, you know, salt water is nitrogen limited, fresh water is phosphorus limited, but essentially what happened is potentially contaminated sand was placed on the template, and given the site location, some of the annulates in that sand might not have a relevant pathway for environmental risk. Some of them may, but essentially allowing that suspect sand to be pushed over and spread with the rest of the template is basically saying, in this case, we're going to allow contaminated sand to be used for mitigation. And I just think that material should be removed, personally.
I want to open it up to the public too for any questions about the chemical analysis of the sand. If there's no other questions or comments from the commission.
No.
Are there any
from me.
questions or comments from the public?
We're all set.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Have a great evening.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
you too.
Hello. Yvonne Ballancourt for the record. I had a couple of questions about the chemical analysis. It's 440 pages, so I looked at it quickly, and perhaps I didn't read something quite right, but to me, it looked like Ledge 6 gray, that sample, had some chemicals that were within the reporting limits. Granted, they were low, but they were. And again, maybe I made a mistake, but dioxane, dichloropropene, bromoform, dibromochloromethane, methyl tert ether, methylene chloride, and methyl isobutyl ketone I found to be within reportable levels for that one sample. And I think that's why, it's a good indication about why you ask for the discrete samples, because if a sample has a contaminant, you won't find it if it's averaged out. I have concerns about the recommendations. I think number 1 is great, and the rest of them, I understand what they're saying about theoretically things getting destroyed, but I agree with Seth. I also think that to expect UV to kill all the bacteria isn't realistic. It's a very superficial way of disinfecting things. It doesn't penetrate sand. So yeah, you'll mix it up and spread it around, but the actual amount killed by UV isn't very much. I do think the salt water will affect a lot of things. Desiccation, however, can actually doesn't kill everything, and some things can withstand that pretty readily. My concern is that I wouldn't say, because typically of a total coliform count, fecal coliforms are typically a low percent, that means that it's a low percent when you have a test result. I think Instead, it would be wise to go out and sample where those levels were really high to see what the actual proportion of fecal coliforms are out there, because the idea was, at least to me as a concerned citizen, is there septic contamination, and that would be a better indicator of that. So I think that might be something to consider, and I would want to know that people are really looking at the data and listening to a second opinion. I think that's really critical. Yeah, and I guess that's it. I would be concerned about people breathing it in. I know how much fine dust gets blown around here, so the idea that it's in the sand, it could blow. It doesn't have to go straight into the water. It could go the other way, or So I have concerns. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other comments, questions from the public?
RJ Turcott, Nantucket Land Council. So, just to sort of summarize, the total coliform levels are unacceptably high compared to what should be on the beach. Fecal coliform levels are based in part on past studies, and chances are they don't apply to what's going on here, especially if this is a suspect site. FC levels and any of the other coliforms that could be harmful could be in a very different proportion if this is from anywhere that could be contaminated by human activity, any of these properties that they've been getting this material from, and they're not sure. This is not clean fill by any definition. And another thing is, yes, the chances of it being ingested are slim, but it's persisted for a few months already in the sediment. And I imagine it's probably pretty evenly distributed throughout the template at this point. It could persist longer, and if barefoot beachgoers nick their foot, gram-negative bacteria love an open wound. You can just ask the hospital, ask anybody. It could lead to other health problems that way, and it's very common. So essentially, this strip of beach is a much more risky place now for the public, and that's not acceptable. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments from the public?
Just make one comment.
Yep.
We're talking about the material that was brought onto the template, the gray material, which, based on the grain size, we think is, where it has a higher component of silt, is likely had topsoil mixed in with it. As I said, the topsoil is where the soil bacteria grows. We wouldn't expect to see soil bacteria on a beach because it's sand. It doesn't have the organics that the bacteria feed on and utilize. So in terms of seeing the counts that are on the intertidal of essentially nil is what we'd expect to see on the intertidal throughout that region. And if we, looking at the beach, that where Jim took their samples right at the toe, yes, that may have some of the gray sand in it, but the beach itself is not a substrate in which soil bacteria lives because it's a sand and not a soil. So I just want to identify that when you start comparing other areas of the beach to the mitigation sand that was brought on, that, as we said, we think has topsoil mixed in with it, whereas the source, we wouldn't expect to see total coliforms in high counts on the beach.
Right, that's why I think we need the a test to prove it, because many times during this presentation you said, well, it's naturally found in soil.
It's naturally found in
Right,
soil.
but we're talking about beach
Correct.
sediment, so it's
Correct.
not naturally found here. So
It's
the
not.
levels are really concerning and high in that
I
case.
hear what you're saying, and with the gray sand that's washing out onto it, but then, as we're saying, is that in that exposure, in that areas, it will die off, and I think, if there was sand that has been washed off the template through this, before any sampling was done into the intertidal, we're seeing that it was next to nil. So I just wanted to reiterate the difference between soil and sand here, and where these bacteria
Well, sand
grow.
is a component of soil, because soil is
Sand-
sand,
sand
silt, and
is
clay. It's all these particle size.
Sand is a
right.
component of soil. What I said in terms of topsoil, which is where where the soil bacteria live. When you get into the subsoil, a B or C horizon, and it's a sand, you wouldn't expect to find that even in an upland location.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
RJ Turcott, Nantucket Land Council. So, even though the sand on the beach below the template is not ideal substrate for coliform, if a storm comes through and washes some of the topsoil material that has coliform in it onto the beach, and somebody with a cut on their foot steps on it before it's able to be desiccated or killed by UV light, it's just as much of a threat as if it were growing there naturally. So the fact that it was placed there is still the issue. It will die eventually, but it still could be an issue for human health.
Thank you. Any other comments, questions from the public? I mean, Jeff, I agree with Ian. I think that having Greg come to speak would be a good idea.
Sure. So I took some notes, not to interrupt, I promise, but Greg is on vacation right now. I literally got him to send me the report as he was leaving his office for vacation. So I will try to schedule him when he returns to be at least available by phone, if not in person, for our next hearing on the 4th. Hopefully we'll make that work. He may be available more readily by phone, if that's acceptable, but you could interact and
Sure. Yeah.
So that's there. So if there's other things that people want, then we can certainly endeavor to get that information to bring this to some sort of resolution at some point.
Yeah, just in terms of action items, so the lab has retained the samples that were taken. So could we have all the samples that tested high for total coliform tested specifically for fecal coliform rather than relying on a order of magnitude estimate?
No, we can't. There's a holding time. Usually for coliform, it's a matter of 24 or 48 hours. Now, we do have that material, but we would need to collect new samples if you wanted additional analyses.
So Jim, are you saying it degrades so quickly?
A lot of the holding times are based on the fact that you're taking a sample, and I'm speaking hypothetically now, a sample out of the situation it had been in and putting it in a different situation, right? It wasn't in a glass jar and now it is, or for the coliform, it goes into a sterilized container, of course. And so relative to accuracy of the method, the precision, all of these tests have holding times. Some in the matter can be a matter of 28 days. Some are 24 hours. So as a, for instance, the first set of samples we FedExed off the island, 2 huge, gigantic coolers, because they didn't want to miss the holding time, particularly for the coliform. So if you wanted additional samples, we could potentially use the material for some. You know, you're going to be looking at at had some precision and accuracy issues. So personally, I wouldn't do it. I would go out and collect more.
Thank you.
Could you take samples at certain, like 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot, like just to see if sediment and chemicals are going down? I guess is the best way to look at that.
On the template?
Yeah, just I was kind of curious because we're talking about like over time, has it been diluted, or is it seriously, is it just moving down the grade? This is the question.
So like if you had a 4-foot section,
Yeah.
is it much higher
Is it
concentration at
concentrated
the
in the
bottom of
bottom?
that 4-foot section?
As opposed to the top?
Yeah.
One moment, please. I have to look at the tables to see if I can. Most of the higher numbers. Now I'm not talking the samples on the beach. They were all collected within the top 1 foot. Most of in the beach samples, they were the southerly samples that had the highest coliform result, which is where the gray sand has been eroding off the template. However,
It's also where it was initially delivered to.
yes, that's right. There's a lot of information in the report, and even I need some time to go through it, so hold on a moment.
You could say there was some sections there that was 6 feet, but you got through it to the.
Yeah, we were able to go 8 feet deep, so 2 4-foot sections. Now, we drove that sampler by hand for a few reasons. If we got a machine out there, we could have just poked holes right through all the tubes, which is not good. I'm almost there, folks. So if I look at the gray samples for coliform, the highest numbers generally are on the southerly side where the gray material is thickest, down near the bottom of that gray material, towards the bottom of that layer. So it's going to be moist. It's going to be protected from weather changes, right? We did collect a couple of samples that were more shallow. The first 3 samples, ledge 1, 2, and 3. Ledge 1, 2, and 3 were collected at about the midpoint of the template. There wasn't much gray. It was relatively thin, and it was at the surface. And the results were somewhere between 1 and close to 2 orders of magnitude lower than what we found with the deeper samples on the south end, which is what was leading me to conclude what I said earlier, that it's my opinion that the additional silt content in the gray material and the fact that it's relatively thick at the south end, so it's protected from weather fluctuation, it's protected from UV, and it's in a moisture environment simply because it holds more water, is what's giving us that result. So that's really what my opinion was founded upon. The question is, could we anywhere, if you want to collect a sample, no matter how long it is, and take bits from each piece. Now you got to collect the amount that the laboratory wants, but you could potentially do that. So the answer to that is yes. I think we've answered in general that question with the variation in depth of the samples we collected out there between basically the middle of the template and the south end. But if you felt you needed more, I suppose
You're asking more for to test for fecal
Yeah,
coliform. Is that possible?
yeah. I mean,
In that in itself?
at this point, obviously, the material that's on the surface or closer to the surface is going to have degraded more into
Yeah,
the
it's more
coliform.
exposed, yeah.
So the deeper soil is going to be more reminiscent of what the soil is like upon delivery.
Right. I guess.
Samples can be collected for fecal coliform analysis.
Which would be specifically humans, would show that there was a septic contamination.
Warm-blooded mammals. So deer, dogs, cats, raccoons. I guess you don't have raccoons on the island, so warm-blooded mammals, seals, human beings, dogs, cats.
In terms of trying to move things forward, Jeff did send Greg Berman's report. I just looked at it. I haven't read the whole thing, but kind of went to the end. The last two paragraphs, bacteria, i.e. total coliform, will die off relatively fast in dry, coarse sand, especially in a sunny environment with energy from wind and or wave. However, dumping soil laden with TC and nutrients over the side of the coastal bank is not an appropriate method for remediation. The Conservation Commission will have to determine if the applicant will need to remove the suspect sand or attempt to aerate, mix it in situ. Both would need additional sampling and analysis of TC, N, and P to demonstrate it's a cleaned up site.
So here's a question.
And so, what I was going to say is, in terms of what Greg is saying, I think we're on a similar page in some respects, in terms of it dying off relatively fast in that environment. In terms of going forward, taking additional sampling, why don't we make an effort to aerate and mix this material? This is your peer reviewer who suggested this. So I'm just saying that I don't disagree with his statement here of aerate it and mix it in situ, and then resample and analyze for TC, N, and P.
Yes, but if it turns out that it's got a very high fecal content 6 feet down, then that's, which we're sort of assuming it does still, because it's 6 feet down and damp and not degrading with UV, then then that's sort of another issue. What do you do with that sand? So I guess I'm floundering a bit about protocols, and I do wonder if it turns out that there's very high fecal contamination at those values 3 months later. And so hypothetically, it would be hard to mix them 6 feet down, wouldn't it?
You'd have to get a dozer out there and start pushing that gray material, which is on the south end of the template, and spreading it out. Now, just to clarify, and I'm not trying to be pithy.
No.
Okay. I was talking about total coliform when I was talking about it being deeper than more shallow. Fecal coliform likes it when it's in our bodies or a warm-blooded animal's body, and it doesn't like it when it isn't. So I'm not suggesting in any way that I think there's a lot down there. I mean, I don't know because I didn't analyze for it. But my discussion was really about the total coliform and not fecal, and I just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah.
Thanks.
When you guys say spread it out, I'm just curious where, because the top of the template's pretty small. So where are we spreading?
But it's quite long, and when you look at the profile that's in the report, you see that the southern end has a deeper it's not a level platform right now. It's deeper on the southern end than on the northern end. So spreading it out from south to north, spreading it out that way, not horizontal, but longitudinal.
Yeah, I guess
And-
I honestly am feeling more along the lines of Seth at this point, where maybe we need to remove some of this. You know, Nantucket's beaches, we have this pristine resource circling our island. I mean, how lucky are we? And then to have our public beach have these contaminants being dumped, I mean, I don't know.
Well, I think we need to discuss it with
Yeah,
a
and town
third,
council, possibly.
the third party, and also Greg suggests also with the Board of Health. And,
Right.
it's just a mess.
Along that stretch beyond the limit of the template, where there, I think it's to the north, there's an exposed leaching pit from a house that's where everything is eroding.
Well, that's really far away because I walk that stretch.
Well, it's what I'm not saying that that's the source on the template. What I'm saying is you have erosion along this shoreline with houses with, you know.
Yeah, that was empty
Yeah.
years,
So you
decades
could
ago.
go to the top of the bluff,
Not
and take
intentionally
samples,
dump
it's
it
a
on.
lawn, a layer of loam
No,
that's
this
there,
is getting
and
silly.
expect to get higher TCs there.
Correct. On the loam at the top of
And
the bluff, you'd expect to find total coliform, because
There's not
that's
enough of it
topsoil.
to actually see it once it gets.
No.
It's
getting
It's basically everywhere. So for the most part, I think of the samples we analyzed, I'll have this answer faster than the last one. We detected it in 8 of the 8 samples of the tan sand. So every sample of the tan we sampled it in, we detected it. We detected it in 8 of the ledge of the gray sands.
Yeah, well, the gray sand's great because there's more.
But we detected more of it in the gray, right? That's so, but my point is, it's everywhere. And
Not
it's,
necessarily
Mixed up
fecal.
there too.
well, the tan sand is pretty distinctive from the gray. And so when my guy tells me he collected a sample of the tan, I believe him. And when he tells me he collected a sample of the gray, I believe him. And my point is only that this stuff is, it's not like it's unique to the gray sand. It's not like it's unique to this one spot. It's everywhere. And in most cases, you're going to detect it. We detected in 7 of the 8 beach samples. Many of those detections were lower the further north we got, but we got them in most of them. Where we didn't detect it a lot was in the intertidal samples because of the salt water. All right. So
You know, Jim, are you seriously telling us that if we asked you to collect samples up and down the bluff, from the bluff at 10, 20, and 30 feet, that it would have fecal contamination? Because I would be very surprised if that, yeah.
again,
that it would-
I'm referring to total coliform.
Right,
Okay.
okay,
So and there's
okay,
a
total
there's a
coliform.
definite difference between the total coliform and fecal.
Well, that's a 10,000-year-old bluff, you know, with virgin sand and gravel coming out of it, and it's going to have coliform contamination?
Very well likely.
From
I think it's could be everywhere.
From the top,
I mean, everywhere meaning
the-
most places. But.
the topsoil on top of the bluff, that's the lawns, that's the vegetated areas that's eroding off when you get beyond the template, because the template is stable right now, that area above the template. So there is total coliform in those topsoils. That's when those topsoils erode off the top of the bluff down the face.
But there is no erosion above the template, above the
but
geotubes right
either
now.
side.
Okay, but on either side, so Dwight, you know, you've got a 50 to 80 foot high bluff, and the topsoil is about 1 to 2 feet of that 50 to 80 foot bluff. So for every foot that it loses, it's like 1%. So it'd be absolutely immeasurable, I would have thought. And excuse me. I guess I don't have anything further to add to this.
Well, if you brought more tan sand in, so to speak, and you mixed it with the gray sand, you could have the same levels. Is that what you're trying to tell us? Because you have tan samples that have higher concentrations, and then you have the gray sand that has a little bit lower. So if you mix it with new fill, are we going to come up with the same numbers?
My expectation is they would be lower than the higher detections in the gray sand, but that we would most likely detect it because we already detected it in 8 of the 8 tan samples. So I think we're going to detect it.
So no matter what, we're still going to be.
Well, I think it's there. It's natural, right? Natural's natural. It's
No
natural.
matter where the sand comes
But
from,
that
it's gonna have some detection.
Also
To
speaks to a
terrestrial
larger problem of dumping sand onto beaches when we
No,
need
I
beach.
understand what you're at. I'm just
but,
trying to say, like, are we going to come up with the
right,
same
but
numbers?
if we need beach compatible sand, this is maybe telling us, well, it's all going to have total coliform that are higher than beach levels. Maybe this isn't beach compatible sand. Maybe it's not acceptable for this location.
Well, I think
For
any
any location.
any location. That's what
if
I'm.
that's the thought process. then-
Yeah, I think we're looking at this one, but I'm like, again, back to my comment. You have to look at every project because they're using the same exact sand.
I don't
it's
know.
not pit. It's coming from the same places. I hate to say it, Ashley. They're
Yeah.
gonna go to a job site. They're gonna bring it to a pit,
Yes and no, though, because we've inspected the other
but we haven't
templates
not
and they
to
don't
this
look
level.
like this.
And I bet, like he just said, if you took this sand from another, you're gonna get the same or something similar. That's why I'm just trying to get to the bottom of it. Like, if it's in Nantucket sand or off-island sand, whatever, let's just talk Nantucket. Is it gonna be the same exact values, chemicals? Are we gonna have the same exact? So I get the look, I get all that, and the extra silt. That's not acceptable. But if we're gonna be putting new sand in and we're gonna mix it and we're gonna get it with the same numbers, then where we at? We're just literally. I feel like I'm seeing my tail in this conversation. And sorry to say that, but I feel like we're getting nowhere.
Right.
So, what's the solution? And it's not dilution or anything like that. If we're going to bring in the same exact sand, that's going to have the same exact values.
Then we'll have to chemically test all sand going over.
And I think that every project's got to do that. I think whether it's in Pocomo or if it's in Nantucket or wherever, if that's what we're going to do, if we're going to hold these guys to standard, I think it has to become within our specs. It has to become a standard that we have to do. And if it is, that's what it is, and that's what we've been doing for 100 years, and that's what the soil has. Then we have to just say, this is Nantucket. This is what's in there.
So this does bring up a really interesting point about, from a virgin pit where we assumed that we were getting compatible sand, what are the values in a virgin pit as opposed to the pit sand, which is now
we've had that pit sand for 10 years or longer. I mean, Dave, maybe.
Well, the tan sand was some of that was sand, virgin sand.
Right.
Some of that tan sand
right.
was brought over from a barge, and I believe the source was Carver.
So I'd be very curious to what the value of virgin sand is with coliform contamination, because that would give us a base in a sense if we're going forward with this.
Right.
Well, and he's saying almost none because the coliform lives in the topsoil. So if you're actually digging down to the sand, there shouldn't be a lot in there.
Well, and there shouldn't be very much topsoil in any of this. We never, anyway. But you're right. We seem to be chasing our tails.
No,
at the
and that's
moment.
where I'm just like, it sounds like we've already got it from another site, and then we've got the gray sand. And I get it, but I just feel like we got to find somewhere to say, this is our clean pit sand that we have to use, and this is the chemical compound that's within that, and that's acceptable. It's like the article I forwarded to Jeff that forwarded you, that these foundations are failing because there's a chemical within that sand, and there's 9,500 foundations. Well, all right, what is Nantucket's? And I think that's where we have to just, if we're going to use the standard for this group, it has to be across the board for every coastal project. Yep. And that's what I just think if they're going to do that, well, where do we say go take a sample inside of someone's pit or this site that we see as virgin, or using Toscana's grade A sand and not the B, or C, maybe do all three of them to find out what's within those compounds as well. So
We set a standard,
Yeah, I mean,
So you get a
I
baseline,
think,
you gotta set
yeah, and what is acceptable? Maybe the C sand, that is the silty and that has that, and we don't want that. Maybe the B and A is acceptable. But I just think we need to set the guidelines so that these guys know what they're working with. I mean, I think they came to us with this, so it was like, now what are we gonna do? Because I think we have 100 sites or something that needs this information as well.
Yeah, the difference, I guess, would be other sites at this point, they don't have enforcements upon them.
No, and
you
I
know,
don't,
so-
I understand that, but I think that we had a couple sites that had some of the brick in it. There was 2 that Jeff mentioned, so I just think we're going forward, and I get it. They're being watched on everything, so it was discovered very quickly. But I think some other sites weren't getting watched, and so this is where we're having a problem. So I just think that we just need to set a standard, and like when we rewrite the regs and all that stuff, we put this information in there, so. But I just think we need to have apples to apples. That's kind of my thought.
Moratorium on these projects until we figure it out.
I think that the fact that we know there's topsoil in the gray sand, even just by that self, is against our definition of what compatible mitigation sand is, as written in the order of conditions. We've had this discussion like for over 10 minutes about how topsoil and sand are different, and now we're trying to claim that it's okay to use topsoil laden sand or laden sediment.
I wasn't saying it was acceptable. I'm just saying we just need to.
Well, no,
You were
it happened once
saying-
and it's done. Now we just have to deal with what's there. And
Yeah,
figure
so-
a way around it.
Well, this is why I'm trying to get at
What to
it needs to be
resolve.
removed. I understand that we're gonna go and put new sediment on it, and that new sediment might have similar levels of total coliform and nitrogen and everything else in it as well. But it needs to be all sand, not topsoil mixed with sand.
Well, I think that there is, if this was a true bank and falling, there would be some, so not to the level that we have.
Of course there is.
The natural bluff out
Cobble,
there
et
has
cetera.
it has the clay heads, it has clay lenses, it has boulders coming out of it. The bluff itself is a heterogeneous glacial landform with a wide range of grain sizes that are coming out of it.
Which actually aren't replicated in what your fill is, and
well,
that's been on.
Because
All right, sorry.
we've
go ahead.
been-
That's how the order is written.
the order's written to match the beach
Well,
sands.
All right,
If
guys.
we're-
So
if
I
we're
feel like we're
going-
really
if we're
no.
going off-
Now we're really going around in circles at this point, and I think that we've discussed having Greg come on the phone, and I think that we got to terminate this if we don't have anything valuable and relevant to add at this
Thank you.
this point.
I
Thank
appreciate
you.
it.
Jim.
I will also add to kind of wrap up. I will get him, and I'll also try to get George available either in person or on the phone as well.
Should we get Roberto Santamaria, just Board of Health, just for?
I have sent him all the information, but I can certainly try to get him here. in
Has he
person
weighed in
or
on
as
any of
well.
it?
He is reviewing it, but they are also busy too. So.
Yeah. Okay.
So I'd be very interested in what the coliform values are of that 9,500 cubic yards of dredge sand from Pulpus Harbor is.
Yeah,
And that,
that's
you know,
Well, now that it's in a saltwater environment, so I
Yeah.
would think they'd be pretty
So,
low.
right, again,
Even though
we
there's a lot of organics in it, but they're in a,
Right. But my feeling is as a percentage, if you actually look at the bluff, I mean, so that's a separate issue,
Yeah,
right?
and
But the bluff, the topsoil is such a small percentage of what comes
the
down.
topsoil is small, but unfortunately with that bluff, you have like animals that can go to the bathroom on the surface of the bluff that could add
My Labrador
bacteria.
retriever would hang his ass over the bluff.
exactly. Sure, there's some landscapers that do it too.
Yeah, small man.
More than you
All right,
wanted
guys,
to know,
we're gonna move on.
Quickly.
So we have another discussion of the bluff, SE 483115, the DEP superseding order of conditions.
So this is more of an update.
Yes.
Give and take it. So, I know we said at the last meeting we were just in front of the appeal deadline. So for those who missed the newspaper and didn't see it, you guys did appeal the superseding order of conditions, and the Wisconsin Beach Preservation Fund also appealed the superseding order of conditions. Both of those documents, the document that we sent into DEP and then the document that SPPF sent into DEP, are both available for review on the town website. So DEP sent out an order of when those pre-hearing conferences are scheduled for. I'm waiting for an update from George on what he's looking to do for those, but they're a little ways off. So we'll have time from there, but that is actively going. And then the appeal in Superior Court is still going forward as well on the local bylaw. So that's kind of where all of that sits right now. So I'm happy to take any questions or anyone.
Jeff, can you, even though it's on the town website, can you forward or email the SBPF's appeal to the
Yeah, I
commission?
thought Joanne had done that today, but if not, I will make sure that you guys
Yeah, I think
get it. All right. Well, yes, I'll make sure you guys get that email to you.
And could you tell the town to stop changing the website addresses?
We have
it
asked.
keeps changing.
It's the worst. So I will tell you,
Awful.
so our website where they moved all of the stuff onto the Laserfish portion, Joanne spent the better part of 2 weeks sorting all of the documents to try to get them back to an order that makes any kind of sense. We asked why they decided to do it, and there's a million different reasons that I won't get into, but we just said, please just, until everything is resolved, please don't touch it anymore. So the link on our Natural Resources departmental page for Baxter filing information will take you to a page where you can just pick Concom files. Joanne has tried to group those, and she kind of actively curates those to make sure that they're in the correct order. And she's actually going through all of those now and putting everything into chronological order. So when you open up those files, you'll see like number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and that will refresh at some point. So everything will be in order for all of the filings that are included, that all the way back to like the revetment application that kind of started this latest round in 2012 or 2011.
So it's best to go to Natural Resources website.
Yes.
And then go through it.
Yeah. It's been quite
Yeah.
the endeavor, to say the least. But if someone feels like something's missing or they can't find it, please call or email, and we'll help direct you to where you're supposed to be. Especially you guys.
Well, it's nice when you're in a meeting just to hit your favorites and bring the page up and go scrolling or trying to find a letter or something.
Yeah, they were trying to unclutter the website from stuff, and they stored it away because I won't get into the nitty gritty of it, but there's a document retention area for like the active web page, and then there's a separate kind of archival, and stuff that sits for a certain amount of time gets dumped into the archival. And that's what happened because some of the early stuff dated back long enough that it hit the trigger, but it was all kind of hooked together, and it kind of went, and we all went, what happened? And then have spent like a month trying to, because we can't really undo it, but trying to get it back into proper construction.
So just on that note, I tried to get the April 10th, 2017 percentage of how many people voted in the non-binding referendum on keeping the beach access free, and that website was, that address was down and I could never find it. And that's just from 2.5 years ago.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Internet.
Yeah.
It's there, but it's not there.
It's not there.
Yo, it's still there.
It's still there.
It's still there.
You just have to navigate to it.
I couldn't find it.
All right, so we're gonna move on to reports. Crack.
We're cracking along.
That was a nice presentation like 10 days ago.
Thank you.
Downstairs. Jeff.
Oh,
okay.
Yep. Yep,
Was
it
Jeff
was.
is that you guys organized?
Yep.
I'll take it.
Well, credit where credit, that was actually organized through the city.
Yeah.
Okay, the civic.
No, but
I
you
don't
you
wanna
did a good job
rain
there.
on your
Everybody
parade.
did a good job.
I thought it was a great presentation.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll pass that along.
Wow, it was good. It was really
Yeah.
I reluctantly agreed to participate about 48 hours in advance of doing that. So
Well, I'm glad you did.
Nice job.
I don't want
CPC?
I was at a site viewing, so I missed it. I'll let you know. I gotta call in.
NP and EDC?
Not here.
Not here. So commissioners' comments?
I will not be here next meeting, but it sounds like I should call in.
We can
yes.
send everyone the call-in information. I'll probably just set up, since it sounds like we'll have multiple callers, I'll probably just set up a conference calling number and code.
I apologize now if I call in.
From all the way from Sun
Gonna be
Valley,
a
I
doozy.
believe.
Yes.
I wish I could believe your apology
I
there.
didn't tell you. He told you.
You know what I think we should do is we should make him Skype it so we can see.
Ah,
Right, like we need a
shushing
holiday.
Like
down.
make sure he doesn't have a nice cocktail with him.
Be like one of those guys. He's in a dress shirt, stands up and he's got his boxers
Notice
on.
it's not clear. It does jingle like there's ice in there.
You're tired, but
It's a hot toddy. Sorry.
Any other commissioners' comments?
No.
All right, administrator staff reports.
I feel like I had a lot of great things to say.
Oh, boy.
Thank you, Andy, for sticking it out to the end.
Hey, Andy.
Thank you,
Do
Andy.
you miss this?
Andy, look at him. He's reading the book. Catching up on your reading.
You know, I don't know what I was going
Thought
to
you
say
missed
now.
it,
Is given the discussion that we've had for a while this evening, we'll try to start to do some research on if there's anywhere else that does that level of sand analysis. And I said it to Greg, and I talked on the phone yesterday for a while, and he and I both agreed, and our conversation kind of reflected it, that the good old days of being like, well, size matches, we're good, are probably at their end. So, it doesn't sound like this is a unique situation to here. This is a little more extreme because it's so big. But apparently there's a lot of talk off island and things about sand availability and sand appropriateness and those kinds of things. So, we may be a little on the front end of it. I know there are lots of spots that use color as a criteria. That's
Right.
We already use the Munsell for lots of soil determinations out here. So those things may be there, but I tend to agree that if we apply it, we have to make sure that we have the ability to apply it evenly everywhere, which is going to be a lot of fun. But that's what it is. And honestly, kind of personal opinion, I think if we see a lot of this stuff continue, it's going to push more and more towards potential offshore resources to meet that criteria that we're going to probably struggle to meet a lot of times from inland resources.
Yeah.
To be fair, it's kind of moving that direction anyways for availability purposes, but I think having some frustrations with other regulations that the state has, not for wetlands, but for other things like fisheries and things, that we're going to probably need to have sound reasoning and science behind regulatory restrictions of this kind of nature. So it may take some time, but I think we just have to climb the path to do that.
Awesome.
We might even be able to find a grant to have someone help us develop that. I'm sure someone very learned somewhere.
All right.
That's it for me.
With that, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Is there a second?
second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Alright, we're adjourned. Well, thanks. I feel fine. You know, I was